Good afternoon, everyone. Our speaker today is Vireshwar Kumar. He is a PhD student with Dr. Junmin Park. He received his Bachelor from IIT Delhi in 2009, and from 2009 to 2011, he worked with Dar Handasa consultancy company in India, and he visited IISc, where he worked on physical layer secrecy before joining here as a PhD student with Dr. Park. And his research interests are cognitive radio, spectrum security, and physical layer secrecy. Floor is up to you. Looking forward to learn something new.
Yeah. Thank you, Dheeraj, for introducing me, and I would also like to thank you, Dr. Dhillon, for giving me this opportunity to present my work here. So today's talk will be related to security issues which we face when we use software-defined radios in cognitive radio networks. Our main focus in this talk will be related to authenticating transmitters who do not follow the spectrum rule. So as the title says, we will first describe what is the problem related to blind transmitter authentication is in terms of the spectrum security and enforcement, and then we would look into the proposed scheme which is trying to solve this issue, and we will also see different facets of that scheme. And we will make sure that we will compare our scheme with the existing schemes and show our performance in comparison with those schemes. So to start the talk, I would just like to point out that spectrum sharing is a requirement of this age, because there is increasing requirement of spectrum band, and the available bands are would not be able to satisfy that requirement. So there is need for spectrum sharing. Now that spectrum sharing has to be done in such a way that the incumbent users which are already in the band has to share some spectrum with the secondary users which are trying to use that spectrum opportunistically whenever the primary user is not using that band. In such a scenario, there are different protocols which have been and standards which have been either already defined or in the process of definition, but the basic criteria among both on all the spectrum sharing based standards is that there is either sharing between commercial primary users with commercial secondary users, or commercial secondary users with commercial secondary users, or there is this sharing or coexistence between the primary users which are federal or state users and commercial secondary users. So the main concern of the security comes when federal users are sharing spectrum with the commercial users. So for example, this the band which is from 3.5 in the 3.5 gigahertz band, that is a radar band in which the federal government uses its radars, and in that band, if there are commercial users, then there are different security issues there. So if we look into the threats which are in that spectrum band, when there is sharing between a federal user and a commercial secondary user, we see that they can be divided into different categories. The categories are defined based on the model that is being used for spectrum sharing. So for instance, if we use the sensing driven spectrum sharing model, in which the secondary users will sense the spectrum, and whichever spectrum is free, they will start using that. And there can be many issues related to that. One of the very famous security threat in that spectrum model is primary user emulation attack, in which the secondary users, the rogue secondary user is trying to emulate the signals of the primary user, and then it is transmitting over there. So the other secondary users are looking at that signal, and they will feel that it is the primary user which is transmitting the signal. So they will not start using that spectrum band. So this is one of the examples of the threat which is at the PHY-layer in spectrum sensing driven spectrum sharing. Now there can be other threats as well. Now if we see to the other model, which is database driven spectrum sharing model, then there are other types of security threats in that model. In the database driven spectrum sharing model, what primary users do is they give their operating time to a database, and the database finds out when is the spectrum free. and it gives the information to the secondary user. But in this model, what happens is there could be different types of attack, and one of them could be inference attack. Now, if there are if radars are the primary users, they would like to hide their location, their time of operation, because since they are installations which are very important for national security, they would not like to reveal their time of operation or the location where they are. But it has been shown in different papers that if you use this database-driven sensing model, then you can actually estimate where the location of the radar is, what is the time of operation. Now, there is another type of privacy issue with the secondary users. Now, in this database-driven model, every secondary user has to give its location to the database to obtain information about which spectrum is available in that location. Now, usually it is everyone is will be prone to giving their location in respect to the information, in respect to the spectrum band they are getting, but they would also like to have some privacy in terms of this trade-off between losing their privacy and getting information about the spectrum band. So there has been research in that area as well. In this talk, what we are going to see is the threat model which is generated due to malicious users. Now, these malicious users do rogue transmissions, which means that these are secondary users which are not following the spectrum rules, and they are trying to interfere with other secondary users which are transmitting in the band, or the primary users which are in the band. Now, looking at that specific threat due to the rogue transmitter, we can divide the approaches to counter that attack into two halves. First is the preventive approach, where you do not allow any malicious secondary user to transmit a signal which can interfere with someone. And the other approach is punitive approach, where if someone has already done a transmission which is not valid, then you try to identify or punish the secondary user which has already done the transmission. So in the preventive approach, there are multiple ways in which you could do it. You can define a zone in which secondary users will not be able to transmit. You can have specific hardware modules in the radios which are called policy engines, which can check whether before every transmission is done, every packet of transmission is done, it will check whether that transmission is following the established frequency spectrum rules or not. Now, we can have tamper-resistant radios so that they cannot change the established policies. We can also have techniques to assess if the radio has been tampered, if the secondary user's radio has been tampered. Or we can have hardware-based transmission modules, which is slightly against the software-defined radio network idea. The second part is the punitive approach. Once the transmission of an interference event has occurred, then you try to do different kind of things. So now the first thing among them is you need to have a network to actually detect if the interference event has occurred or not. Now that network of sensors can be separately installed all over the place, or you can use crowdsourcing, which means that other secondary users will be listening to other secondary users, and if there is an interference done by a secondary user, other secondary users may report it to a regulator. Now, in order to have this in the working model, we need to identify or authenticate each secondary user. So we need an authentication scheme to identify the secondary users. After the identification is done, we need to localize where the secondary user is. If we could actually send a signal to the secondary user and it stops transmitting, or it stops in making any interference, it is all right. But if it is not possible, then you need to localize where the secondary user is. And then we can have adjudication process where you could have revocation of a spectrum rights, or you can have economic penalties on that. Now, so all these different areas are being researched, and the group with Dr. Park is looking into different areas of this field. My research is basically the authentication scheme to identify the rogue transmitters. Now, to identify, to have that model of transmitter identification or authentication in the spectrum sharing scenario, we need to define actually the problem which we face in the spectrum sharing, which is unique to all other identification or authentication scenarios. So we call that problem as blind transmitter authentication, and it has mainly 4 characteristics. The first one being that the identification needs to be done blindly, which means that if there is a transmitter, it is transmitting to its intended receiver. Now, if there is a node or a sensor receiver which is trying to identify the transmitter, it is not seeing the transmitter signal directly, because so there are 2 issues. That it is not, suppose there is a beamforming being done between the transmitter and the receiver. So the signals are being directly transmitted from the transmitter to its intended receiver using beamforming. Now the sensor which is trying to identify the transmitter is not receiving the signal at a very high SNR. The other issue is because there is no communication between the sensor node and the regulator and the transmitter, they would not agree on a particular protocol to use between themselves. For example, the FFT side, if they are using an OFDM based signaling scheme, they would not, so the FFT size may be different for a software defined radio. So they can use the different FFT size for their OFDM message signaling. Now, if you do not know the FFT size, it would not be possible to decode and demodulate the signal. So if a sensor node which is trying to identify the transmitter, it needs to either know or estimate the FFT size to actually identify the transmitter. So, but because it is not an intended receiver, transmitter would not tell it beforehand what is the FFT size of its transmission. So we need to identify that transmitter with little or no information about the transmission parameter. And it should also have, yeah.
So in regular standard, there's very defined.
Yes.
What if the rogue guy just tries everything?
Yes, so usually what we are looking at in this scenario is a software defined radio, which can use any size of FFT size or cyclic prefix size. So it may have a long list or it may have a short list. But here we are assuming that it is a software-defined radio which can use any, 2 software-defined radios can agree on a particular FFT size and they can start communicating between themselves. So now the other part is it should, so this authentication mechanism that we are trying to overlay on this message signaling, it should not have a lot of overhead in terms of the data rate or the power. And as I said that it is not the regulator or the entity which is trying to identify is not the intended receiver. So it will be receiving low signal to interference plus noise ratio, and it will also be looking at the signals which are faded. And it should also provide security against an adversary. So there are 2 challenges in 2 folds. First is that since it is blind authentication, the robustness is an issue because you are not seeing a signal at a very high signal to noise ratio. You are seeing the signal at a very low signal to noise ratio. So it is very difficult to decode the message signal. Now, the other facet is that since you are not directly communicating with the transmitter, it is difficult to establish a secure medium between the transmitter and the entity which is trying to identify the transmitter. So these are the 2 challenges, main challenges in this blind transmitter authentication. Yeah. So we assume that, so for now we can assume that there is a sensor network. So you have a primary user in an area. Now the primary user is not transmitting. So that the spectrum in that whole area is now being shared by secondary users. So for secondary users, you can assume that there are Wi-Fi users which are like secondary users. Now that whole area is using now Wi-Fi type communication to communicate among themselves. Now the sensor network is a third type of entity which is like policing nodes all around that area, which is trying to identify the transmissions of the second user. No. Only the sensor nodes which are trying to sense that identify the interference event or events which could be harmful to the coexistence of the spectrum sharing. Only those are trying to authenticate it at the PHY layer. Yeah, so we will discuss it in more detail when I discuss the actual model. So further going into the actual existing schemes which are there in the literature, we note that we can divide this identification or authentication approaches into two halves. One is based on the intrinsic approach and the other is based on the extrinsic approach. So intrinsic approach means every transmitter has some circuit imperfection. Now you can identify, it has been shown that you can identify each transmitter by the circuit imperfections that they have. For example, if there is an oscillator in the transmitter which upconverts the signal from baseband to the actual transmission frequency, there would always be some error in that, error of few kilohertz if it is upconverting it to, let's say, 2.4 gigahertz. So there would always be some error, and it has been shown that you can identify transmitters uniquely based on that unique frequency offset that you have in the transmitter. Or every transmitter will have a certain pattern in which it goes. The amplifier in that transmitter will have a certain pattern in which it goes from a zero power level to a certain power level. So that pattern of raising its power from a zero to a certain power level is also unique to each transmitter, and it has been shown that you can use those characteristics. But as you can see that those are very prone to noise, and those can be emulated by others, and it can be easily emulated by others, and you can have an attack called impersonation attack. That suppose your transmitter has a frequency offset of 2 kilohertz. Now others may have a frequency offset set other than 2 kilohertz, but they can certainly make their signal look like their signal has a frequency offset of 2 kilohertz. So if you are using the intrinsic properties, they are not very secure against attacks from an adversary, but they can be those things can be estimated blindly. So blindly, what I could do is so in the estimation of message signal which you are receiving, the first thing that we do is to synchronize with the signal, and for synchronization we estimate the frequency and the time offset. So these few parameters which are like frequency, time, they are estimated before actually decoding or demodulating the message signal. So in order to estimate the frequency and the time offset, you do not need to know a lot of information. So blind identification is possible when you are using those type of intrinsic approaches. Now there is another type of approach which you could do, is to actually making controlled changes in the message signal, so that you can authenticate the transmitter, which means that you are actually embedding an authentication signal which corresponds to the identity of the transmitter into the message signal, which corresponds to the actual data that is being transmitted. Now in this control changes, what you could do is the easiest thing is to share power between the message signal and the authentication signal. For example, you give 90% power to the message signal and you overlap your authentication signal with 10% power of the transmitter. And this way you can do sharing of power, or you could do sharing of data rate. And in this way you are actually making controlled changes in the message signal so that the identifier could identify the transmitter. Now the advantage is that it will be robust against channel noise, but the disadvantage is that in order to actually identify or authenticate, you need to do the same type of processing that you do for the message signal, which means that you need to be able to decode or demodulate the message signal as well. So it will not be a blind authentication because you do not know the parameters of the message signaling. So we looked into different schemes and we found that none of the existing schemes satisfy all the characteristics of the blind transmitter authentication concurrently. So therefore we worked on this problem, and to understand the whole processing of this solution, we define our network model in this manner. So there are 5 entities in this model. So the first one is the Alice, which is transmitting. The second one is the Bob, which is an aware receiver. So which is someone which is communicating with Alice and which has the agreed message signaling with Alice. Now Bob also knows about the authentication mechanism. So it can extract the authentication signal or the identification signal from the message signal. So there is standard communication going on between Alice and Bob. Now there is another receiver which is called unaware receiver, which is Charlie, which is also doing a standard communication with the transmitter Alice, but which is not either interested in the authentication signal or it does not know about the authentication signaling scheme. Now this compatibility with this type of signaling is important, because if you are trying to enforce an authentication scheme on the secondary users for spectrum sharing, some of the users may say that, okay, we do not want to have that PHY-layer authentication. We already have authentication at different layers, network layers, application layers, so we don't want a PHY-layer authentication scheme. So we need to have compatibility with those kind of receivers as well. So we call that as unaware receiver. Now the fourth entity, Dave, is called the blind receiver, which is actually the regulator. Now that blind receiver, it does not have any information about the message signaling scheme, but it is trying to authenticate or identify the transmitter. Now the Eve has the knowledge of authentication as well as message signaling scheme, and which is an adversary, but it does not know the key which is used in the authentication signaling. So what this means is that usually in cryptography, what you do is you encrypt a message and you make it public. If you do not have the key, you would not be able to forge or authenticate the encrypted message. But if you have the key, you can do that. So Dave has the key, the blind receiver or the regulator has the key, so it can authenticate or decrypt the signal which is being transmitted, but Eve does not have the key. Now the message signaling model that we are assuming is OFDM based model. So it is frame based, and each frame contains some preamble symbol followed by the data symbols, and each symbol contains some data samples along with the cyclic prefix. So the important assumptions that are being made here is that the preamble symbols are repeated in each frame. So which is the common standard in OFDM based signaling scheme. And also the assumption being made here is that the parameters which are estimated in each frame separately. So you have if you want to do any estimation like time synchronization or frequency synchronization, you do it in each frame. So and these assumptions are valid for the existing standards as well. Now, if in regards to this model, the challenges which we need to solve are Alice has to generate the authentication signal and then embed it into the message signal. Then Bob has to extract the authentication signal as well as the message signal and verify the authentication signal. Charlie has to only extract the message signal, and Dave has to only extract the authentication signal. Now, this whole process can be divided into actually 2 challenges. One is the PHY-layer scheme, which will ensure that you are able to embed the authentication signal into the message signal, and the other is the actual authentication mechanism, which will be related to the generation and verification of the authentication signal. So the second problem, which is the authentication mechanism, is more related to cryptographic problem, and the first part is more related to the PHY-layer authentication scheme. Now this presentation is related to the PHY-layer authentication scheme. Currently I am working on this cryptographic problem of actual authentication mechanism. I will also, if time permits, I will also give us overview of what that cryptographic authentication mechanism means. But mostly this talk is related to the PHY-layer authentication, PHY-layer scheme, which will ensure how to embed the message signal into authentication signal and how to extract. Now, before going into the actual scheme, we define few performance criteria for evaluating our scheme. The performance criteria The first one being the overhead on the message signal due to the scheme. So what we are doing is we are trying to embed a separate authentication signal into the message signal. So we are trying to see if there is an overhead on the message signal, overhead in terms of data rate or power. Now we also want to ensure transparency for the unaware receiver, which means that if you do not know the authentication mechanism, the way in which the authentication signal is embedded into the message signal, you should still be able to decode and demodulate the message signal. Now we also need to look at what is the rate at which the authentication is possible. Then what is the robustness of the authentication signal calculated in terms of the bit error rate of the authentication signal. Now this authentication of concurrent transmission, this is very important, because when a secondary transmitter is doing interference to a secondary transmitter, it means that there are multiple transmissions happening at the same time in the same spectrum band. So you need to be able to extract identity of all those transmitters which are doing transmission at the same spectrum band at the same time. This is different than the existing PHY-layer authentication mechanism, where we assume that there is only one transmitter and there is only one receiver which is trying to identify or authenticate that transmitter. Here there could be multiple transmitters and you are trying to identify each of those transmitters. Then we need to look at into the blindness of the scheme, the amount of knowledge that you need to actually do the decoding of the authentication signal. So if the knowledge is less, it is better. And the security threat, this security threat is in terms of specifically in terms of authentication. So there are some schemes where what you could do is you can affect the authentication mechanism without actually significantly affecting the message signal. So for example, if you are sharing if there is a scheme which shares the power between message signal and authentication signal, so let's say 90% of the power is given to the message signal and 10% of the power is given to the authentication signal. Now in order to break the authentication mechanism, what a jammer could do is it can transmit with only 10% of the power. So it will jam the authentication signal, but it will not significantly affect the message signaling. So this security threat is specifically to break the authentication signaling mechanism.
What is this authentication rate?
Yeah, so authentication rate is that so you will have a length of so you need to identify the transmitter. So the identification will have, let's say, identification value will have 100 bits. Now, what is the time in which you could receive those 100 bits? So it is similar to the data rate of the message signal. So we are defining a data rate for the authentication signal. Yes. Yes. Eve. Yes. So in here, in the context of PHY-layer authentication, the aim of Eve will be to break the authentication mechanism. So which means that you jam the authentication, only the authentication part, without jamming the message signaling part. So we will look into the other security threats. So as I said that there are two aspects of this whole blind transmitter authentication. One is the PHY-layer aspect, and the other is the actual authentication mechanism aspect. So the second part, which is the actual authentication mechanism, it will look into the issues like privacy, integrity, impersonation, replay. It will look into those type of attacks. But when we look at PHY-layer, the possible attack in this blind transmitter authentication scheme is the jamming of specifically jamming of the authentication signal. Yes. Yes.
It does not try to get it. Yes.
So that will be part of the second the authentication mechanism. So either you could generate the authentication bits in such a way that you could fool the authenticator. So that will be part of the actual authentication mechanism that you use. So at PHY-layer we don't. So at PHY-layer we don't see that. So Now, so this is the proposed scheme that we came up with. So in this scheme, what we do is we generate the message signal as usual. So if it is an OFDM based signal, you generate the OFDM samples for each symbol, then you add preamble samples into that, and you are ready to transmit it. But just before transmitting it, what you do is, so you also have generated the authentication signal in bits. Now here we assume that this is a random sequence of bits. Now when we look into the actual generation and design of these authentication signals, we will see how we are actually designing the authentication signal. But here we are assuming that this authentication signal is just in bits. Now you are trying to embed those bits into the message signal. So what you do is you embed it in terms of the frequency offset. So once you have the message signal in samples, you can do a simple vector multiplication to actually embed a certain amount of frequency offset. Now, so what we could do is we could shift it by a certain frequency let's say 5 kilohertz in one direction, if we want to embed an authentication bit of 1, and we could embed a frequency offset of -5 kilohertz if we want to embed an authentication bit of 0. So you could either do, so actually what we are doing is we are shifting the frequency of the whole signal in one way or the other to embed an authentication bit of 1 or authentication bit of 0. Now there could be multiple levels of this shift. Either you could do only 2 shifts to embed 1 bit of information, 1 or 0, or you could do multiple shifts to embed multiple bits at the same time. So what we are doing is, for each frame we are shifting the center frequency of each frame. So suppose we are actually, if the transmitter would have to transmit something at 2.4 gigahertz, we are not transmitting it at 2.4 gigahertz. We are transmitting it at 2.4001 gigahertz. And then again, if we want to transmit it another authentication bit, we are transmitting at 2.3999 gigahertz, something like that. Now we will do more analysis as we go further. Now, how we extract the authentication signal. Now this frequency offset is very similar to the carrier frequency offset that we see in normal cases. So every transmitter will have an oscillator which have this property that it will not be actually generating the center frequency at the exact value that it should do. So there will always be certain frequency offset. Now, there are 2 frequency offsets but that frequency offset remains constant. So that is the important part, that frequency offset remains constant. The carrier frequency offset that is embedded into the signal by the transmitter or by the receiver, that remains constant. And what we are embedding, it is a variable frequency offset. So those variations can be detected, and that variation has the information about the authentication bit. Now what we claim here, that there will be no effect on the general message signaling scheme, because anyway there are preamble symbols and pilot symbols attached in each OFDM frame. So every receiver which is intended, it can do the message signaling as per the standard which are already there. So in the similar way, we can say that Bob, who is the aware receiver, it can estimate the embedded frequency offset using preamble symbols and pilot signals, and use that estimated frequency offset to generate the authentication bits and authenticate the signal. Now the Charlie can do the same, and it can just avoid the frequency offset is the estimated values of the frequency offset. That is what generally the receivers do. They will estimate the frequency offset, use that frequency offset to correct the frequency offset in the message signal, and then they discard that value of the frequency offset. So here what Bob, who is the aware receiver, what he is doing is, it is also utilizing the frequency offset value to extract some information out of it.
Can you choose any value for the frequency offset, or does it have to follow?
Yes, there is no. So the frequency. So there are few trade-offs which I will discuss it in the further. I can tell you, but there are few trade-offs. We will discuss that in the later slide. Now, this is the most important part. Dave, who is the blind receiver, it has to extract that authentication signal. So there are 4 steps that it needs to do. The first is signal detection and sampling. Now here we assume that the center frequency and the sampling frequency is known to the blind receiver. This assumption is valid for all the standards which are existing at this point. So center frequency is defined for all the transmission that happens. So those are the discrete values, and everyone knows what the center frequency is for each spectrum band. Now the sampling frequency can be, about sampling frequency, it can be said in the same way. Now the second step is the symbol synchronization. So what you need to do, you need to find the symbol boundaries where each OFDM symbol starts. So which means that you are actually trying to estimate the FFT size, cyclic prefix size, and then the sample offset when you actually started looking at the signal. So for that we utilize the correlation induced due to the cyclic prefix into the OFDM signal. Now then you will have to do a frame synchronization, which means that you need to find what are the number of symbols in each frame. The blind receiver does not know what are the number of symbols in each frame. So it needs to estimate that as well. And then it had to find the symbol offset as well. For that we will use the correlation induced due to the preamble symbol. Here we already assume that the preamble symbols in each frame are repeated. And now finally it will have to do the frame frequency estimation, which means that for each frame now it will have to estimate the frequency, the embedded frequency offset to actually extract the authentication signal. To do that also we use the correlation induced due to the cyclic prefix. So note that here what we are using is just the correlation, which is just a vector multiplication of a few samples. And so the correlation between the CP cyclic prefix samples and the data samples. So we do not need to know what type of modulation is being used to actually generate those samples. So either you generate it using a 16-QAM or QPSK, the correlation between the cyclic prefix and the data sample will remain the same. So, the important point to note here is it does not depend on the way what type of error control coding you use, what type of modulation you use. It does not, none of that is important here because you are just using the correlation. So that is why this scheme is very close to a blind transmitter authentication scheme. Now for symbol synchronization, as we said that we will use the correlation between the cyclic prefix. So here what NF represents is the size of the FFT size, and NC represents the size of the cyclic prefix. And if you closely look at this likelihood function, you will see that this is nothing but just a correlation between the cyclic prefix part and the data samples corresponding to that cyclic prefix part. And so when there is no authentication embedded, which means that the transmitter is transmitting the signal without any authentication signal, the parameter that you obtain using this likelihood function, so sigma s square is the signal to noise ratio, and fc is a constant frequency of carrier frequency offset, which will remain constant. So the parameter that you see is the multiplication of the signal to noise ratio and the exponential of the carrier frequency offset. But when you actually embed some authentication signal, so what you are doing is you are shifting the frequency of the whole signal. So now, if assuming that you are doing that randomly, then there is a term which comes to that. So for simplification, we assume that we are shifting it into only 2 levels. So you are either doing a plus shift or a minus shift. So then you see that there is a cost term which gets multiplied to it. So what this means is that if you shift it more, then it will be difficult to synchronize with the signal because the peak that you are trying to detect will be multiplied by a cost function. So the peak will, so if you shift more, the peak will get lower and lower. So the synchronization will be difficult. But if you shift more, if you shift more, it will be easier to detect that shift. So that is the trade-off here. If you shift more, it will be easier to detect that shift. But if you shift more, it will be difficult to actually synchronize with the signal that you are trying to do, because the peak that you are trying to detect will be lower because of this cost term. Now, so what we do is estimate this carrier frequency. So there are two frequency offsets in the signal now. There is one carrier frequency offset due to the oscillator, which is a constant, and there is an embedded frequency offset, which is carrying the information about the authentication signal. Now this carrier frequency offset is a constant term which can be estimated using this parameter lambda during this process of symbol synchronization. Now we go to the frame synchronization, which utilizes the correlation between the preamble symbols. So the likelihood function that we use for it is just showing that we are calculating the correlation, and we are trying to estimate the number of symbols in each frame, number of OFDM symbols in each frame. So when we are, so that likelihood function will result into a peak, which will actually equal to the SNR if there is no authentication embedded. But if there is an authentication signal embedded using that EFO, then this is you will actually again get the reduction of that peak, the value of the peak. Again, you see that if you increase that shift, you will see a lower peak. Now the last part is the frame frequency estimation. For each frame, now you are trying to estimate the embedded frequency offset. So again, you are using the correlation between the cyclic prefix part and the data sample. So when you estimate the frequency of each frame, it will contain two values. One value due to the actual constant part of the carrier frequency offset, and the other value which is carrying the information, the frequency offset that you are varying, that is the embedded frequency offset. So to extract the embedded frequency offset, you actually remove the constant part from the total frequency offset that you obtain. And the estimation of, now you need to estimate each bit of authentication that you have transmitted. So what you do is you see what has been transmitted and what has been received, and you do, it is simply like a PAM modulation. So what you are trying to do is you are trying to map what authentication symbol you have transmitted. So here you note that the estimation depends, so the estimation will be better if the value of FA, which is the embedded frequency offset, is larger. So to analyze this theoretically, we actually compute the Kramer-Rao lower bound, which will give a lower bound for the mean square error in the estimation of the frequency offset for each frame that you are doing. So note that here, rho, which is the signal to noise ratio, is in the denominator. NC, NF, and NC is the cyclic prefix size, that is in the denominator. NF is in the denominator, which is the FFT size. NS is in the denominator, which is the number of samples in a symbols in a frame. So all of them are in the denominator, which means that your error will be less if you have larger size of cyclic prefix. Your error will be less if you have larger size of FFT. Your error will be less if you have larger number of symbols in each frame. And the second, so this is about the mean square error in estimating the frequency. Now there is another error in this authentication scheme. You need to estimate the authentication bits from the estimated frequency. So the second layer of error is due to that estimation error. So that will depend on the maximum allowed frequency offset, which is represented by FA, and the number of levels in which you divide that frequency offset, which is M. Now, so now we go to the result section. So this is the first simulation result, which shows that as you increase. So first, let me tell you about something about the maximum allowed frequency offset. So all the IEEE standards allow for a certain amount of carrier frequency offset in the message signal, because the oscillators that are being designed, they cannot have very high accuracy. So the accuracy that they are expected to have is 25 ppm, so which translates into 60 kilohertz for 2.4 gigahertz. So if there is a Wi-Fi device which needs to transmit at 2.4 gigahertz, so the oscillator that you need to design for that transmitter can have a carrier frequency offset of 60 kilohertz. So this is in the standards.
channel has not received any select.
Okay. Yeah. So So what I was saying is, IEEE standards allow for the frequency offset to remain in the message signal. So what we are trying to do is to utilize that redundancy that has been already in the message signal, and to just use that redundancy to embed the authentication signal. So our scheme can be implemented without actually creating a new set of standards for embedding the authentication signal into the message signal. Now, note that 25 ppm results into a significantly high value, 60 kilohertz. And what we are using in this simulation result is a very small value, which is 5 kilohertz and 10 kilohertz. And even with those values, and if you notice the SNR range, it is from -10 dB to 0 dB. So what we are showing here is, at even such low signal to noise ratio, and even with such small frequency offsets, you would be able to ensure that there are, so the transmitters are being authenticated, even at such a low SNR ratio. Now, so the few things which are very obvious is that if you increase the maximum frequency offset, which is FA, you will get better error performance. If you also have low number of levels in your division of frequency offset, then you will have better error performance. Now, this second simulation result shows that if you increase the number of samples which you are using for correlation, you will have better performance. Which means that if you increase the number of symbols in the OFDM symbol, or the FFT size, or the cyclic prefix size, then you will have better performance. One important point to note here is the estimation is dependent on the number of symbols that you use for correlation, which means that for frequency estimation, what we are doing is we are using the cyclic prefix of each of the OFDM symbol in one frame, which means that the number of samples that we are using for correlation is given by the multiplication of the cyclic prefix size and the number of symbols in each frame. So if that value remains constant, the error performance will remain constant, even if you change the number of symbols in each frame or you change the cyclic prefix size. Now, the other part here is that there exists a trade-off between the bit error rate that you want for your authentication signal and the authentication rate that you want to use. Now, if the frame size is very small, then you are actually transmitting. So suppose we are transmitting one authentication bit in each frame. So if the frame size is small, in a particular amount of time, you would be able to transmit more authentication bits. But if the frame size is larger, then in a particular amount of time, you will be able to transmit less authentication bits. So there is a trade-off between authentication rate and BER. Now, there is a trade-off for transparency as well. What this means is, we showed that transparency means that in each frame, the parameters are estimated independently. Now, if you remove that restriction that we do not want to have transparency, then you could embed an authentication bit in fewer number of samples than a frame. So here the entity, the unit in which you are embedding the authentication signal is a frame. Now, if this is because we want to have transparency in our signal, but if we do not want to have transparency, you can embed more number of authentication bits. Now, this is the simulation results showing that our scheme is able to actually identify or authenticate two simultaneous signals. So in this, to generate this curve, what we are doing is we are using two transmitters. They are using the same parameters, same FFT size, same cyclic prefix size, and they are transmitting with the same power. And they are also embedding different sequences as their identities, but they are using the same scheme of having two levels and shifting it by 5 kilohertz. Now, in this case, what we would look is, when you are trying to synchronize with them, you will see two separate peaks. So you note that the signal to noise interference ratio here is 0 dB, which means that both are transmitting at the same power. And you could see two separate peaks in this correlation value of lambda, which means that if you synchronize with one of the peaks, you will only correlate the cyclic prefix part of that transmitter with the data samples of that transmitter. So if you are synchronizing it with the other transmitter, you are only correlating with the cyclic prefix part of that transmitter with their data samples. This means that you will be estimating the frequency offset embedded in each transmitter separately. So therefore you would be able to identify multiple transmitters concurrently if they are not overlapped, if these two peaks are not overlapped.
So effectively the M value increases, right? If there is more interference and they are not transmitting exactly at the same frequency, then effectively your M value is increasing, right?
So the M value is the value in which you are dividing your maximum frequency offset that you are trying to do.
Right.
So okay, yeah. So what you are saying is
you could think of these interferers as sort of like again signals embedded in your own signal.
Yes, but they will actually, it will not be like having multiple M values. It will be like a Gaussian noise to your signal. So it will, because the OFDM signal itself is a Gaussian noise. So if they are not actually doing the transmission at the same same samples, then it is actually a Gaussian noise. Yeah, it is simply like a Gaussian noise. Okay. So now here we do a performance evaluation of our scheme. So we see that the overhead at the transmitter is very small. It is just a vector multiplication to embed the frequency offset. Then at the Bob, which is the aware receiver, there is no overhead because it is anyway doing frequency offset estimation. For Dave, which is the intuitive and which is the blind estimator, it has to do blind maximum likelihood estimation. Now our scheme is transparent to Charlie. The authentication rate is equal to the message frame rate if the levels you choose is 2. And it is very robust against noise. It allows authentication of concurrent transmissions. And it needs to have, this scheme needs to have the knowledge of the center frequency and the sampling frequency, which is the minimum that we could do. And in this scheme, there is no possibility of specifically attacking the authentication signal and not attacking the message signal. If you are trying to affect the authentication signal, you are affecting the message signal as well. To compare the existing scheme, we use the same type of message signaling. We use QPSK modulated signal with the same 50 size, cyclic prefix size. And so there are two other schemes with which we compare. So our scheme is called FEET. Then there is another scheme which is called Gelato, which uses the existing, these Gelato or the authentication technique using modulation ATM, they are not blind transmitter authentication scheme, but they have been designed in such a manner that with some modifications you could extend it to a blind transmitter authentication scheme. So that is what we did. We extended it to make it a blind transmitter authentication scheme. So what Gelato does is, in an OFDM signal, you repeat some subcarriers. So the data on subcarriers is repeated. So if you repeat some data on subcarriers, you generate a cyclostationary signature. So you use that cyclostationary signature to embed the authentication signal. Now for ATM, what you do is you have, so let's say in QPSK modulated signal constellation, you have 4 points. So you rotate it in one way or the other to embed an authentication bit of 1 or 0. So you rotate that modulation to embed the authentication. So that is a phase-based authentication mechanism, the ATM. So we compare our scheme against these two schemes. So the existing, so in the comparison, you could see that the our scheme, which is FEET, is better, improves over the ATM by 6 dB and over Gelato by 3 dB. When we use the AWGN channel, we assume the Gaussian noise. If we assume a relay fading model, that ATM, which rotation, where we are actually rotating the modulation to embed the authentication, it does not work because of the relay fading model. Now, when we see the cyclostationary signature, it does work, but still our scheme performs much better than the cyclostationary. No, oh, so these are the bit error rate of the authentication signal. So the authentication signal that we are receiving. So at this low SNR values, it is not possible to decode the message signal. If you are looking at -5 dB, it is very difficult to decode the message signal. So these are the results for the authentication signal. We are trying to identify the transmitter. So we also did some experimental validation. So for that we used LabVIEW. So we used USRPs, and we configured USRPs using LabVIEW, and we showed that what you could do. So as we already discussed, that what you need to do is generate the samples as you generate in an OFDM signaling scheme, and what you do is at the end you just do a vector multiplication. And our results show that the implementation that we did was very close to the actual simulation obtained from the MATLAB. So here what we are assuming is, so as you must have already done if you have done the implementation, what we do is we keep the receivers at the same place. We receive the signal over the air from the transmitter, and then we add noise at the receiver to add additional noise to the receiver to get a curve of SNR versus a bit error rate. So here what I want to note that the curve which is showing the message signaling, there is some difference in the implementation and simulation result, but the curves which are related to the authentication signal, there is no difference. Which can be easily understood by the thing that we are correlating a large number of samples to actually estimate 1 bit of authentication signal, which makes the Gaussian approximation very close to the actual simulation result. So yeah, so this is what I got, but there is certainly something. So what I was doing is there is a actual text. Actual text is being transmitted in the implementation. So actual text with a timestamp. Then I synchronize with that timestamp, and then I compare 2 text messages. So in that comparison of the text messages, so text message is not a random message. So you need to compare. You need to know what you are transmitting to compare the bit error rate at the receiver. So I cannot use a random sequence at the transmitter and then try to estimate the bit error rate at the receiver. So a known text is being transmitted from the transmitter, and that is being compared. So there is some discrepancy here.
But you could use a random sequence which is known, right? I mean.
So you need to. So if you are using, so what we are trying to do is a very long sequence, and then you are trying to calculate the bit error rate at the receiver. Now you do not know where that. When you are going to receive that, at what part you are going to start receiving that random sequence. So if you know that, okay, you are going to start receiving exactly at t is equals to 0, then you can correlate, then you can compute the bit error rate. But you do not know when exactly you are going to start decoding that random sequence.
But the same problem will come when you have when you try to reconstruct text from bits, right? So you don't really know what your first bit corresponds to.
So for that we are actually sending some synchronization. You can say synchronization bits in the form of timestamp.
Okay.
So we are sending those timestamps, and then you actually see those timestamp and try to find where the timestamp starts, and then you start correlating from that point.
Right. So I was saying you could do the same thing with a random sequence as well, right? I mean, you could embed a known timestamp in a random sequence. Now that's not truly random. That is known. It's sort of arbitrary sequence which is generated through a random.
Yes, we can do that as well. Yes. Okay, so this is some future work which is related to the actual design of the authentication signal, but we don't have much time for that. Yeah, we are already over time. So, so when we actually look into the design of the authentication mechanism, we actually see the different security threats like privacy, integrity, impersonation, replay. So we can, at this point, I am working on this side of the problem to actually generate a mechanism, authentication mechanism, which will ensure that. Yeah. So it is more related to cryptographic stuff rather than PHY-layer stuff. And this is the summary of what we did here. So the future. So I will just like to show what is the future work here. So now here what we assume that we have one receiver which is trying to identify or authenticate the transmitter. Now we can have cooperation between multiple receivers, and they can merge their information to obtain the actual identity of the transmitter. And the other direction of the work is to actually find a practically employable signature scheme, because the existing signature scheme, which can also provide privacy, are not practically employable. Which means that since you are actually transmitting your identity everywhere at PHY-layer, so every receiver is able to identify you if you are not hiding your identity. Which means that where your location, your time of operation, nothing is private. So what we are trying to have is a privacy preserving scheme, and in that context there is no practically employable privacy preserving scheme. So people have come up with better scheme. So we are also trying to come up with a better scheme than the existing one. So yeah, so that is the end of the talk. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it can estimate. So it can see the frequency offset. It can estimate the frequency of offset. It can find the identity. The malicious that Eve can find the Eve, which is an adversary. It can find the identity of the transmitter as well if you are not using a privacy preserving scheme.
It does not have the key.
It does not have the key. Yeah, so the Eve, which is, it cannot generate a valid identity for itself. So what happens in cryptography is you have an identity, and then you have a certificate for your identity, which is a verified certificate from a regulator. So you cannot use any identity. So you have an identity, and then you have a verified certificate from a third party that this identity belongs to you. So, and that is done using a key. So yeah, so that's what I'm saying, that at physical layer, if we are only looking at the physical layer scheme, then the aim of Eve is to try to the attacks that Eve can do is just to jam the authentication signal. So other things that it can do is so the other things don't matter at the PHY layer. If you just are looking at the physical layer properties, then those things that you may be thinking. So let me go back and explain this slide. So if we have an authentication mechanism, we can save the privacy of the transmitter. We can have the information integrity, which means that the identity that so you cannot tweak the identity and still ensure that your identity is verified by some third party. Then you cannot have impersonation attack, which means that you cannot impersonate someone else's identity and show that this is someone else. So if Eve tries to impersonate Alice, it will not be able to do that. So these are the properties of the authentication mechanism, the design of the authentication signal that you actually do. These are the properties related to that. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. So okay. So what you are trying is very close to we call a replay attack. So what you do is you listen to the transmission from someone else, and you do the same type of transmission from your end. So that is called a replay attack. So that replay attack is usually countered by using a timestamp in your signal. So if you see the design of this signal, we utilize a timestamp in our design of the authentication bits. So since you will be listening and then you will be transmitting, there will be a difference in when you have listened and when you have transmitted. But by the time you have transmitted, the timestamp would have expired. So your that sequence of authentication bits will not be valid. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, only 2. Yes, there are only 2, but they are adding the information about the bits, so you can go in either of the 2 ways in each instant of time. So then you are actually jamming the message signal. So there is no counter to that. If you have started jamming the message signal, then there is no counter to that. So so there is no counter to jamming. What we are trying to see here is, can you specifically jam the authentication signal without jamming the message signal? So that's what that is what the attack. So as I said that you can rotate. So as one of the schemes said that you can rotate the QPSK modulated signal to embed the authentication signal. Now in that rotation, what actually happens is sharing of power between the message signal and the authentication signal. So if you rotate more, your performance of, if your rotation is more, if you rotate in one direction by more, and if you rotate the other direction by more, you are actually gaining more in terms of the authentication and performance. But if you rotate less, your performance will be less. But it affects the performance of the message signal. So ultimately it boils down to sharing of power. That scheme boils down to sharing of power. So in that sharing of power, as I said, that if you share 10% of power to your authentication signal, 90% of power to your message signal. Now if there is a jammer, it is transmitting at 10% of your power. So it will completely wipe out your authentication signal, but your message signal will still be decodable. So let's say it is 80% of the power of the signal you are receiving, which means that the receiver is receiving the power at the 80% of the transmitted power, which means that you will be able to decode and demodulate the message signal, but there is no way you could decode the authentication signal if there is some jammer which is jamming at 10% of the power. So this means that you can specifically target the authentication signal without targeting significantly the message signal. If you are jamming with full power, then there is no way to counter that. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
We ended the talk on an interesting note about jamming. Our talk next week is about how to counter jamming in OFDM by Matt Garrett. Okay. I guess you just laid down the foundation. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Is there any form to sign like
Very nice work.
Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion.
Oh, yes. So when I